All right, guys, I posted the lecture from Monday's class that goes over the major muscles of the shoulder, but today I wanted to speak specifically about the rotator cuff muscles and kind of how our shoulder weighs this balance between stability and mobility. Okay, so as a reminder, our shoulder has much more mobility than our hips, same classification of joints, but we can afford to dislocate our shoulder and still run away from danger. Can't afford to dislocate our hip. Now, in today's modern times, you're still going to live, call an ambulance, come pick you up. But our ancestors, if you dislocated a hip, it was a bad day, right? So we put a lot more investment on our protection of hip integrity. Big old acetabular socket. We have a ligament inside called the teres ligament. And then we have these big, powerful muscles that cause the hip that also added stability. And then to double down, we don't give it the same range of motion. We don't give it as much opportunity to come out the socket. Okay, so usually when someone dislocates their hip or breaks their femur, it's in an automobile accident, or they might have had like some medical osteoporosis, or they're older, and so when they fall on their hip, it's a much bigger deal. Our shoulder, however, we do not have such a socket. We have a much shallower socket. When I was going through school, it was described, Dr. Bob used to describe it as a golf tee. So the golf tee is still technically a socket. It's just not much. The golf tee is just to prevent the golf ball from rolling off, but it's not literally meant to encapsulate it so that it doesn't fly off. Does that make sense? But unlike the glenoid fossa, the golf tee is vertical. Our golf tee is horizontal. So in other words, if this was truly a golf ball on a golf tee, it would just roll right off. It would just fall right off. So we have to have mechanisms in place to give us the mobility that a shoulder joint needs, but also to maintain the integrity of the glenohumeral joint to make sure the golf ball stays on the vertical golf tee. Okay. And a few ways we do that is with our rotator cuff muscles, and I want to include our biceps brachii, long head, and our triceps brachii, long head in that conversation. Okay. So the first thing I want to talk about is muscles that live kind of inside what I like to call inside the capsule. So remember, I always talk about how synovial joints have this water balloon, and there's synovial fluid. It's literally meant like engine oil you put in your car to help minimize friction. It's the same stuff, just our bodies check oil light. Okay, and we have muscles that are, I like to look at it as living in the country. Pecs, quads, hams, muscles that have a lot of room to grow living out in the country. They can hypertrophy a lot easier living out in the country. You know how goldfish, they will grow to the size of their environment? You put them in a little fish bowl, they're going to stay tiny. You put them in a big lake, they're going to get bigger. So our pecs and our deltoids and our country living muscles can grow big, but the muscles that are inside the capsule, we actually have to limit. It's like keeping a goldfish in a little bowl. We actually have to limit how much these muscles can grow because we have nerves and vessels, we have plumbing, we have a lot of stuff happening inside the city here, and we can't have too much hypertrophy or all that hypertrophy is going to get in the way of all of our plumbing and wiring. Does that make sense? So some of you that work in clinics, if you have let's say a torn, depending on the severity, but if you have a pulled muscle in your country living muscle, you rehab that, no problem. Very vascular, they get lots of blood flow. But when you have tears to the stuff that's on the inside, one of the ways we limit how much they grow is to limit their blood speed. That's how you limit the growth of the muscle. You just don't give it as much nourishment. You give it some, but you don't give it as much as these big country living muscles. And so when you have a tear or damage to the inside, that's why usually you got to go and fix it, because that's how we limit their hypertrophy on the inside. Okay. So one of the things I'd like for you to take notice with the picture I have on the wall is that these rotator cuff muscles are pulling literally on the ball, on the golf ball itself. So if you think about it, if I'm going to have an adductor pulling muscle, I kind of have to pull on the neck. If I'm just pulling on the ball, that's not trying to adduct or abduct at all. It's just literally trying to compress the golf ball into the golf tee. Okay? So if I'm going to have an abduction puller, I need to cross over the top. And if I have an adduction puller, I need to kind of yank down on the neck. So when I go over the lady between two majors, the latissimus dorsi between the pectoralis major and the teres major, these are yanking on the neck, on the actual shaft of the humerus. But when you have muscles that are just pulling on the golf ball, that's literally just trying to translate the ball into the socket to try to keep the ball from falling off. Okay? Now, the rotator cuff muscles get their name because together they're encapsulating the ball of the humerus, supraspinatus on the top, subscapularis in the front, infraspinatus teres minor in the back. And in fact, that groove, that bicipital groove, is naturally occurring because you have these rotator cuff muscles and this rotator cuff muscles literally parting, like parting the Red Sea, like creating bony growths on the top and on the front, on the back, literally creating that groove for the biceps to pass through. It's kind of cool. We're going to get to the biceps and how it helps our stability as well. So by itself, the subscapularis is an internal rotation puller, as I described. And with the infraspinatus and teres minor, which are external rotation pullers, when they're working together, they cancel out transversely and work together translatory to try to keep the golf ball on the golf tee. So I think in the video, I use this analogy, but sometimes I guess I forget to use it. But you've heard the cliche, covering your bases. You want to cover your bases. So we're covering our bases. We're encapsulating golf ball muscularly on the front, on the top, and in the back. Subscap, supra, infra, and teres minor. Ligaments alone don't maintain our joint stability. We need muscles. So muscles influence our motion, but they are also there to help provide some extra joint stability. Okay. Now, how would so just as a reminder, infrateres, external rotators, subscap, I talk about how it's like deli meat in between the bread of the scapula and the ribs. And then the supra travels through that little tunnel, comes over the top, and inserts over the top, covers our base on the top. Okay. Has anybody ever noticed when you're doing like shrugs or you're holding something heavy in your arms, you'll feel like your bicep and tricep like puff up or contract? You ever notice that before? Like if you're lifting a heavy bucket or if you're doing shrugs, like you literally feel it in your arms. Yeah. And maybe you haven't, that's okay. But if you're lifting something heavy, there's traction. We call it traction. I've heard that word before, right? Literally, you have weight trying to do this to your shoulder. And there's no bone underneath the head of that humerus to push. So the biceps, that's why I have this next picture, just as a reminder. biceps brachii, long head. Let's see. There we go. Biceps brachii, long head. That's this little red dot right here. So the biceps brachii passes through that little groove, stabilizes the humerus anterolaterally, and hooks onto the golf tee. So if you have something that's trying to create traction or literally yank your humerus down, it makes sense that I need to recruit some muscles that are kind of preventing it from going down. So your biceps brachii, long head here, your triceps brachii, long head is attached right there, the infraglenoid fossa. So it's also translating by pulling up. Think of it as elevator cables. You have your bicep and your tricep literally pulling in a straight line up, preventing your humerus from translating down. Does that make sense? So when you have a tear of the biceps brachii, long head, sometimes they'll refer to that as a lesion, a slap lesion. But when you tear that long head, and it'll pull apart a piece of your labrum. Labrum is like your suction cup. So like here's your socket, and you have a suction cup that's attached to it. And the suction cup in your shoulder literally does what we think it means. If you take does everybody know what a suction cup is? I used to play with them as kids, but like you'd put them on glass, right? If you wanted to put something on your window or on your door, you'd have like a little suction cup. And what that does is called negative pressure. You push out all the air and it literally creates a vacuum. You know what I'm talking about? The little suction cups? Now, those suction cups maintain their integrity as long as they can maintain that negative pressure, that vacuum. But if you take a pen or a pencil and you kind of pry, and all of a sudden it loses that negative pressure, all the air rushes in and it loses its integrity and it's going to fall off, right? It's the same thing happening here. Your labrum is like a suction cup around the bone of the socket. And there's negative pressure. There's a vacuum that also helps keep the humerus on the socket. It's like a suction cup that's happening there that helps to maintain our joint stability. And if you tear a piece of the suction cup, it's going to lose that vacuum and you're going to have more instability. Does that make sense? So when people have tears to their labrum, you got to go in and fix the vacuum. You got to go in and fix the suction cup, or the shoulder is going to be much more unstable, and then you're going to have secondary problems. You're going to have your car's making noises when you drive it. That doesn't sound good. It's probably going to lead to other problems. You got to go get it fixed. So when you have this extra instability in your shoulder, there's going to be more wearing and tearing. There's going to be more arthritic changes. And you got to go in and fix it. So I just wanted to bring that up. So the biceps brachii long head and the triceps brachii long head, although they have function, direction of pull at the shoulder, in other words, biceps brachii long head is a flexor abductor. Triceps brachii long head is an adductor. Technically, they have functions at the shoulder. Their real function is to try to help maintain shoulder stability. Because you have country living muscles that are going to do most of the grunt work in terms of actual moving. But you have to have insurance policies to make sure that the machinery stays where it needs to be while you're doing these motions, especially overhead. Dr. Wynn Lyle, who was an ortho while I was at Auburn, he said, if you have a bruised rotator cuff or a problem with your rotator cuff, He said that's going to cause problems even though your country moving muscles are healthy, because every time you bring your arm up, or those rotator cuff muscles are going to be pulling, they're going to be working to keep that golf ball on that golf tee. So if there's damage to those muscles, you're going to feel it, even though the deltoids and the pecs and all these other muscles are fine. You're still going to feel it in your shoulder. And obviously that's your body's check engine light. When the check engine light goes on, that doesn't mean everything's messed up in your car. It just means there's something in the car that needs to be looked at and fixed. So rotator cuff, it gets its name because of the individual functions of, like, the subscapularis is an internal rotation puller. The infraspinatus teres minor is an external rotation puller. So 3/4 of them are pulling in specific directions of rotation, but cumulatively, their real benefit is to maintain the articulation of the glenohumeral joint in the absence of, like, our hip maintenance of articulation, because we can't do these things we do up here if we didn't allow for it. And what you gain in stability, you're going to lose in mobility. And what you gain in mobility, you're naturally going to lose in stability. Okay? So I just want us to kind of use a little bit of logic. When we see these circles and we talk about function, let's see, that there's going to be some muscles that are naturally more important than other muscles. We have words for prime movers, like superstar muscles. So it's like when we see biceps, brachii, long head, and short head as shoulder flexion pullers, that's true. But when you're doing a front raise, it's not like those muscles are dropping 45 in an NBA game. They're contributing, but your anterior deltoid and the anterior fibers of your pectoralis major, like, those are carrying most of the load. If a muscle looks bigger and stronger, it is. Okay? And it also makes sense in terms of when I was given that analogy about country and city living. Look how these big meaty parts turn into strings, and those inert strings is what goes into the city and crosses over and is pulling, because again, you have our brachial plexus runs down there, and you have all these vessels and all these nerves and all this wiring. And so we can't create too much congestion in the shoulder capsule. So that's kind of cool. We had that in our ankle, if you remember, how the muscle itself, the meaty part, was like in the country, like in the shin. And then when it came time to get in to cross the joint, it became a nice, sleek, slender tendon that could cross and then go and influence. And it's kind of neat. All right, let me go back to the circles and just see if we have any questions or clarifications. So our primary shoulder, I'm just going to talk about kind of the things that might be weird and different. This is what I just lectured on. How our subscap, infra, and teres minor are literally pulling on the anterior-posterior axis. So in other words, they're not in the front or in the back or on the top or inside. They're literally pulling on the golf ball. And the front one does try to spin internally only. So in other words, it does cross the polar axis. External, internal. Does that make sense? But they're on a bowl, and the bowl is on the AP and the bilateral axis. So the subscap doesn't cross interior. These do not cross posterior. This is on both axes, just like this is on one axis and this is on another. It's like, so that's what I wanted to emphasize today. The supraspinatus, however, does cross the anterior posterior axis. And that's going to be the last emphasis today is showing you how impingement syndrome works. So you see this red part above the spine of the scapula? This is the spine of the scapula. And so we have infra, just means below, infraspinatus, and supraspinatus. That's all that means, supra above, infra below. So this muscle, the supraspinatus, comes through that little tunnel and inserts right here on that tubercle against the greater, lesser and greater. So because it crosses over the top, it's an abduction pull. Does that make sense? But it's still covering a base. Even though it's an abduction puller, it's preventing the humerus from doing that. So we're covering all of our bases in front, over the top, back, encapsulating that humeral head to try to keep it on the socket, along with our suction cup that we have on that labrum. Okay. Now, the last part that I'm going to talk about today before we get into some practice is, unlike our hip, when we use our prime movers, and let's say I'm using my hip flexors or my hip abductors, those muscles are not only trying to rotate me, but they're also trying to translate me because they're pulling at an angle. But I have this big socket, this big hip socket, that's pushing down on my femur so that those muscles can be called that a force couple. So in other words, when I'm trying to recruit these big hip muscles, the socket itself is literally pushing down on the femur while my muscles are pulling up on my femur. The socket is pushing down on the head of the bone while the muscles are pulling up on the shaft of the bone. Does that make sense? Okay. We don't have a socket to push down on the humerus here. There's nothing to push down. So one of the roles of the rotator cuff muscles is to try to pull down. So if you notice, those rotator cuff muscles are not just pulling in, they're also pulling down. So they're trying to pull the humerus down. If those muscles don't maintain the inferior kinetic pull of the humerus will slide up a little bit. Just think about it. Your deltoid and these muscles are not just trying to rotate it, but they're literally trying to translate it up as well. And the supraspinatus will then get pinched in between the acromion and the humerus. Impingement. Dr. Bob used to use this analogy. He would say, one tap on the shoulder will get you attention. But if you tap the same place for an hour, it might create ecchymosis. In other words, the sum total of a lot of little taps might actually create damage. Think about that for a second. You take a paper clip and you bend it once, no big deal. But if you bend it enough time, what's going to happen to the paper clip? It's going to break. It's going to fail. It's going to fracture. You take a piece of paper and you pinch your fingers in the paper and you start pinching and twisting. A few times, nothing's going to happen. But eventually, the paper is going to tear. So it's very similar. People that do overhead work, if their rotator cuff muscles aren't doing their job of maintaining the natural position, and the humerus somehow shifts up and gets put, if your muscles aren't going to pull down on the humeral head, then the acromion is going to push down on the humeral head. Does that make sense? This is the acromion. And it may not be 1 hour, it may not be 2 hours, it may not be 10 hours. But eventually, this paper clip is going to tear. If you're pinching it and twisting it, and pinching it and moving it, and pinching it and irritating. So when you guys are doing rotator cuff exercises, it may seem monotonous and redundant, but the whole point is to try to get those muscles to be able to do the job of keeping the humeral head down and in so that the humeral head doesn't have the acromion push it down. And another thing with rotator cuff exercises is what I led off the lecture with, is that they don't get as much blood supply as our big country muscles. So their rehabilitation, their adaptation to stresses takes long. And when you do have tears or injuries to them, that's why your body can't necessarily fix itself, because it doesn't have the blood supply. We limit the blood supply. And so you have to go in, the doctor has to go in and fix it. Right? So that's why even in healthy athletes, and I'm considering occupational workers athletes, I'm considering kids athletes, they want to go out and play in recess. That's their occupation, is to be kids. A good rotator cuff program is always indicated for these reasons. If you maintain the strength of the rotator cuff, you have a better chance of not having problems. Because once you have problems, it's almost like you're 3 steps behind trying to catch up with it. And another issue I want to bring to the table is in athletics, we have off seasons, right? So in other words, you're playing football. For me, I played sports, but it was all single A, so it doesn't really count. But I was an athletic trainer in college sports, and when we would have certain injuries, we could do maintenance, pain control, because we knew in the off season we were going to fix it. And based off of the doctor's recommendation, it wasn't going to cause any, extraordinary, serious long-term damage. Let's get through the season, and in the off season, we'll fix it. Rehabilitated in the off season, they'll be ready to go in spring or during the season. Guys, occupational workers, they got to work to get paid. Like, there's no off season for some people. How many of you know like wrestling? Like, I'm not talking like I'm talking like professional wrestling, like back in the day. Still do. There's no off season. Or at least for, like, you had to work to get paid back in the day. Now they're contracted, they're taken care of. But so it makes sense that when you're working or you might be doing consulting. Some of you might be doing ergonomic consulting or occupational biomechanical consulting. It makes sense that you want to do preventative rehabilitation, preventative stuff, trying to stay ahead of the game. Because if you're slinging tires at the Uniroyal factory, or you're an electrician, or you're a welder and you're doing overhead work, and you get contracted and you get paid per the hour, and you're having shoulder pain, like, it makes sense that a lot of these guys and ladies are going to push through the pain, maybe not say anything, mask it with medicine, keep working. Like I said, you keep doing this to the paperclip, eventually it's going to fail. Okay. So our mindset in KNES typically is athletic mindset, where we have traditional off seasons and you could rehabilitate it in the off season. But some of our clients that we're going to be working with, there's no off season. So we have to be mindful. And there are things we can do, like trying to ergonomically redesign the workstation to make it less stressful or make it less taxing in certain things. Teaching them proper mechanics on doing the shoveling or utilizing tools to help them work overhead. There's some things you're going to learn in grad school for that. But I just want to bring up that with those rotator cuff muscles, one of the reasons it's always like they're playing catch up is because they don't get the same blood supply as some of the other muscles. Any questions? You ever think about like why we roll up the towel? You know, in the clinic, you roll up the towel. One of the reasons is because if we're doing like TheraBand exercises, see if I think I should have a good picture of TheraBand. So one of the reasons is that's my favorite. I use this one on the test all the time. So if we don't have the towel and you're doing, the external rotation using your external rotators, who are those muscles? Infraspinatus, teres minor, posterior deltoid. But if we don't have the towel, some people say, well, they just want my hand to go out. And if they don't have a lot of motion or they run out of motion, they'll abduct to make the hand go out. Right? Look, I'm doing great. And so one of the techniques putting that towel is to keep the arm in, because if you abduct, there's also, some people say it creates space inside that, but it's mostly so that you don't compensate with unwanted motion for people you're working with, to make sure that that motion is what you want and not what they think you want. So, little things like that. Any questions? So again, it's not to say that the biceps, tendons, and the triceps aren't secondary players to some of these motions, or the rotator cuff for the same reason, but their primary service. In fact, some people that overthink the problem, but I love overthinking the problem, they'll refer to the biceps brachii long head as your fifth rotator cuff. Like some people refer to it as that. But the stability and the integrity of that shoulder joint, those are some of the players that help maintain that ball and socket in the absence of a big socket. All right, guys? All right, y'all have a good day. I'm going to go meet with Dr. Mayo.